It was just another Monday morning at the 13th precinct, the kind of morning where the stale scent of burnt coffee mixes with the low hum of tired officers pretending to care. Paperwork was piled high, radios buzzed lazily in the background, and the usual banter echoed through the hallways, sarcastic, jaded, and often towing the line. The front doors creaked open. No one looked up at first. No alarms, no special announcements. Just a man, black, middle-aged, dressed in casual streetwear. He walked with purpose, though his steps were unhurried. His face held no fear, only calm scrutiny. He scanned the room, quietly absorbing the environment like someone who had been here before, but was seeing it for the first time. At the front desk, Officer Daniels noticed him. Daniels was the type everyone in the building knew by name. Loud, cocky, always ready with a joke that walked a dangerous line. He leaned back in his chair, squinting. "You lost, sir?" Daniels asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Cafeteria's not open to the public." The man didn't respond, just kept walking, slowly, silently. Daniels stood up, taller now. "Hey, I asked you a question. You can't just stroll in here like it's your house." Still no response. The stranger stopped a few steps in, turning his gaze toward the hallway where officers gathered around a whiteboard, laughing about a recent case. Daniels took a few steps forward, his tone sharpened. "I said, this area is restricted. You need to leave now." The room began to quiet. A few officers turned their heads. Something in Daniels' voice had shifted. This wasn't casual anymore. The man finally looked at him. His eyes were steady, not confrontational, not submissive, just watching. Daniels didn't like that, not one bit. And then he did it. A sharp sound cut the room as Daniels, with a smirk and no hesitation, spat right onto the man's chest. Silence, pure, dead silence. The smirk faded. Even Daniels realized he might have gone too far, but it was too late. The moment was frozen, the kind you can't take back. The man looked down at the spit, slowly wiped it off his jacket with a handkerchief. No reaction, no anger. Just a pause, measured, deliberate. Then calmly he reached into his coat. One hand, one motion. He pulled out a badge, turned it toward the room. His voice was low, but every word cut through the air like a blade. "My name is Raymond Carter. I am your new chief of police." Gas rippled across the floor like a wave no one saw coming. A clipboard dropped. A coffee cup slipped from a hand. Daniels turned pale. In 1 second, the entire power dynamic flipped. The stranger wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had come to judge them. And no one saw it coming. Chief Raymond Carter had seen it all before. 30 years in law enforcement, from beat cop to federal task force, from small-town stings to big-city political chaos, he'd walked through fire in every form. Corruption, cover-ups, broken trust between the badge and the people. But nothing quite prepared him for the weight of this department. The 13th precinct wasn't just bruised, it was rotting from the inside. 2 weeks before he ever stepped foot into that building, Carter had received the first box of complaints. Overstuffed files, yellowed pages, closed cases stamped in red ink. Lack of evidence, witness recanted, internal review closed. But what stood out more than the ink were the patterns. Excessive force reports, all swept under the rug. Disciplinary hearings that mysteriously disappeared. And one name, Officer Daniels, repeated too many times to ignore. Carter had asked for the precinct's body cam logs. Half were lost. He requested community feedback. What he got was a wall of silence. The kind of silence that didn't come from satisfaction, but from fear. City Hall had made him promises. Full authority, no interference. But Carter knew better than to trust politicians. Real change didn't come from the top. It came from knowing who stood next to you in the hallway and what they were willing to do when nobody was watching. That's why he didn't announce his arrival. No press conference, no photo op, no grand welcome, just a quiet entry, civilian clothes, a test for them and for himself. The moment Officer Daniels spat on him, that test ended, and the real work began. Carter stood in a quiet room now, minutes after the reveal. Officers scattered, unsure of what to do. No one offered to clean the mess on his jacket. No one apologized. He didn't need them to. He needed them to feel the shift. He called his assistant outside, told her to schedule an emergency department-wide briefing. No exceptions, he said. Every single officer, in uniform, in the briefing hall by noon. Then he requested the full internal roster. Not the one HR showed the press, but the real one. Who was on suspension? Who kept their badge after complaints? Who got promoted while the citizens they policed disappeared from the system? He pulled up the precinct's CCTV logs, started watching footage from the past month. Saw Daniels laugh while pushing a teenage suspect against a wall. Saw an officer ignore a woman's screams in the lobby for 12 minutes straight. Saw two patrolmen exchanging fist bumps after what was supposed to be a tense arrest. Carter had been in law enforcement long enough to know what it looked like when a place forgot what it was meant to do. And this place had long since forgotten. Back in his temporary office, he stared at a wall that once held framed commendations. He told an aide to remove them. Every last one. Empty walls are more honest, he said. For Carter, leadership wasn't about medals. It wasn't about sitting behind a desk with a star-shaped plaque. It was about accountability. And when accountability goes missing, the walls shouldn't pretend otherwise. He picked up the phone and called Internal Affairs. Activate the audit, today. I want every open complaint re-examined. And tell legal I'll sign whatever I have to. Nobody's immune, not anymore. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room carried weight just by having him in it. Outside, a few officers were whispering, "Who is this guy? He's going to tear the place apart." Good. That last voice belonged to Officer Lane, one of the youngest on the force, fresh out of academy, still believed in the oath, still believed in the people. Carter heard him through the open door and made a mental note. Watch that one. He might still remember what it means to serve. As Carter sat at the desk, he opened his notebook, the one he always kept close. No digital files, no assistants, just a pen and his own memory. He wrote only one line. The fish rots from the head, but I'm not here to clean, I'm here to cut. Because sometimes to fix what's broken, you have to break it a little more first. And the 13th precinct was about to be cracked wide open. It's easy to assume that the biggest threats to justice come from outside the system. Criminals, gangs, chaos on the streets. But Chief Carter knew better. The real threat, the one no one wants to talk about, lurks behind uniforms, within locker rooms, in hushed conversations between colleagues who've stopped caring about the badge and started protecting each other instead. He'd seen it before. The brotherhood, the code of silence. Officers covering for one another not because they believed in the truth, but because loyalty was easier than integrity. Inside departments like these, justice wasn't blind. It was gagged and shoved into a corner. And that's exactly what he'd felt during his undercover walk through the 13th precinct, before the spit, before the reveal. He'd watched officers ignore phone calls from citizens begging for help. One call came from a grandmother reporting her missing grandson, an 11-year-old who hadn't come home from school. The officer at the front desk rolled his eyes, muted the ringer, and said, "Probably just some kid acting out." Not my problem. Carter stood only a few feet away. No one even asked him who he was. He walked past an open locker door in the hallway. Inside, scotch taped to the metal, was a crude cartoon of a black man in handcuffs with the words "usual suspect" scrawled above it. No one batted an eye. No one tore it down. He noticed laughter behind the evidence room door. A couple of detectives joking about a suspect who had been roughed up a little too much last week. They laughed like it was part of the job, like violence was a perk. But the worst was Daniels. Daniels didn't just play the part of the loudmouth tough guy. He reveled in it, boasting to another officer about how he put a punk in his place the night before. "You should have seen the look on his face when I slammed him on the hood," he said, grinning, like I hurt his pride more than his ribs. Carter had paused at that moment. His instinct told him to act, to speak, but he knew the power of observation, especially when no one knows who you are. What disturbed him wasn't just Daniel's behavior. It was the way no one stopped him, the way others chuckled, nodded, or simply turned away. That told him everything. This wasn't one bad apple. This was a tree with rotting roots. He watched a young Latina officer pass by Daniels with her head down, clutching her report folder like a shield. She didn't say a word, but Carter could see it in her eyes. She knew. They all knew. They just didn't think anything would change. That's when he realized the culture in this building wasn't toxic by accident. It was protected, nurtured, hidden behind a curtain of blue that no outsider was supposed to see. And that was the point of his undercover visit, to look behind the curtain, to witness the casual corruption that internal memos and training videos couldn't reveal. No one expected him to walk those halls without a suit. No one thought the black man in civilian clothes could be the one holding the highest authority in that room. That's why they felt so free to show their real faces. The masks dropped, and Carter caught it all. By the time Daniel spat on him, Carter had already made his decision. He would not ask these men to change. He would force it. Later that afternoon, while reviewing internal footage, Carter took notes, not on infractions, but on behavior. Who looked the other way? Who laughed? Who winced? Who walked out of the room? This wasn't just about punishing Daniels. It was about identifying enablers, the officers who didn't spit but said nothing when others did. The silence was as dangerous as the act itself. Carter knew it would take more than policy changes and retraining seminars. This department needed a cleansing, and the first step was exposure. The curtains were coming down, and everyone in the 13th precinct was about to find out what accountability really looked like, up close and personal. By the time noon rolled around, the briefing hall was full. Every officer, detective, lieutenant, and administrative clerk sat in stiff silence, the air thick with tension and confusion. No one knew what to expect. Whispers circled the room like static, some claiming the new chief was just another pencil pusher from City Hall, others insisting something big was coming. They were all right, and all wrong. Chief Carter entered the room with no theatrics, no entourage, no fanfare. Just him, a small black folder under one arm, and a quiet, commanding presence that made every head turn without a single word. He stood at the front, eyes sweeping across the room like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, not angry, not emotional, just clear. "Let's begin," he said. No welcome, no introductions, just those two words. And then he opened the folder. "In the last 48 hours, he continued, I've reviewed over 300 hours of surveillance footage. I've read 127 internal reports, 43 citizen complaints, and personally watched body cam clips that, quite frankly, made me sick." A few officers shifted in their chairs. Others tried to look unfazed. Daniels, sitting in the back row, crossed his arms and stared straight ahead. Carter didn't flinch. "This precinct has a culture problem," he said plainly. "Not a staffing issue, not a funding gap, not even a training problem. A culture problem. One that's been allowed to fester under the protection of silence, arrogance, and a misplaced sense of loyalty." He took a step closer to the edge of the stage. "This morning, I placed 3 officers on immediate suspension pending investigation. Officer McGuire, Officer Hensley, and Officer Daniels." Daniels' jaw tensed. The room stiffened. Carter looked directly at him. "Yes, you. You spat on a civilian who you thought was beneath you. You mocked a mother who came in here crying about her son. You bragged about violence like it was a game. And you're not alone?" He closed the folder. "I didn't come here to rearrange furniture. I came here to tear out mold." The silence was deafening. "I know many of you took this job with honor in your heart. I know some of you still do. I see it in the quiet ones, the ones who speak up when nobody's listening. I see it in the late-night patrols that go unrecognized, the community officers still walking the beat with dignity. But let me be very clear. If you are silent in the face of abuse, you are part of the abuse. If you laugh at injustice, you are complicit in it. And if you protect those who poison this badge, then you do not deserve to wear it." A murmur rippled through the room. He let it hang there. Then he continued. "Starting today, all body cams are to remain on at all times during shifts. No exceptions. Tampering with them will result in automatic termination." Several officers looked at each other uneasily. Internal affairs will now operate independently within this building, with direct access to me. Every complaint will be reviewed by an external civilian oversight board. I've already signed the order. He held up a signed document for all to see. This is not up for debate. Now the murmurs grew louder. One sergeant raised his hand. Sir, with respect, this is going to kill morale. You're turning every officer into a suspect. Carter's gaze fixed on him. Number, I'm turning every officer into a professional. If you need darkness to do your job, you're not doing your job. You're hiding your crimes. The room went cold. Carter stepped back and looked out at the sea of faces. Some angry, some confused, some relieved. I know what happens in locker rooms, he said. I know the nicknames, the jokes, the threats. I know about the officer who's been driving past a whistleblower's home every night. Lights off. I know about the evidence that went missing from locker 318. I know the language some of you use to describe the people you're sworn to protect. And I know how easy it is to think no one is watching. He paused. I'm watching now. No one dared move. And so is the public. He walked slowly across the stage, his voice lower now, but sharper. I didn't take this position for politics. I took it because I'm tired. Tired of seeing the same headlines. Tired of funerals with folded flags and no justice. Tired of good officers being drowned out by bad ones, while communities lose faith in all of us. He stopped. And let me be clear. I am not here to inspire you. I am not here to win your approval. I am here to do a job. And if that job means cutting half this department out to save the soul of what's left, then I'll sharpen the blade myself. A few heads dropped. A few sat straighter. And to those of you who still remember why you joined this force, to serve, to protect, to uphold something bigger than yourself, this is your moment. You don't have to whisper anymore. You don't have to walk on eggshells. The tide has turned. Speak up. Step forward. Be part of rebuilding something worth believing in. He turned to leave, but then stopped one last time. And Officer Daniels. Daniels looked up. Consider this your last moment wearing that badge. I suggest you use it to apologize to the people you've hurt. You'll need their forgiveness more than I need your cooperation. And with that, Chief Carter walked out of the hall. No applause, no cheers, just silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Because for the first time in years, the 13th precinct wasn't covering up a scandal. It was facing one. And the reckoning had only just begun. The days following the chief's address were unlike anything the 13th precinct had seen in years. The building no longer buzzed with the careless arrogance that once defined its halls. It echoed instead with a quiet tension, an unease that stretched from the dispatch desk to the lieutenant's office upstairs. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching, listening, taking notes. Officers who once felt untouchable were suddenly second-guessing every word, every move. Every conversation that once happened openly in break rooms or locker bays now came in whispers, behind closed doors, eyes darting toward the nearest camera. The culture was shifting, and fast. But it wasn't just fear that gripped the precinct. Something else was taking root. Reflection. Some officers, particularly the younger ones, began to question not just their coworkers, but themselves. Officer Lane, the rookie who had muttered "good" after the chief's dressing down, had become a quiet symbol among the few who still believed in the mission. He didn't speak out loudly, didn't grandstand. He just did his job, by the book, with calm respect. He began arriving earlier, staying later, reviewing complaints in his off hours. Not because he had to, because he felt he finally could. Then there was Officer Sosa, the Latina officer Carter had noticed that day in the hallway, shrinking in the shadow of Daniels. She'd kept her head down for years. She wasn't a rookie, but she wasn't a veteran either, just stuck in the middle, torn between silence and survival. But now, something in her had changed. One afternoon, she walked into Internal Affairs unprompted and handed them a written statement. Names, dates, conversations she'd overheard, behavior she'd witnessed, but had been too afraid to report. It was a risk, a huge one, and Carter knew it. When he read her statement later that evening, he didn't feel pride. He felt sorrow. Sosa hadn't been silent because she didn't care. She'd been silent because she believed the system would crush her if she spoke. And up until now, it would have. Carter added her name to a growing list. Officers who might help rebuild what had been lost. Because while the rot was widespread, the roots of hope were still there, buried under years of fear. Not everyone responded the same way. A small but loud faction of officers had begun to push back, complaining about witch hunts, about how morale was plummeting, about how they were being punished for doing a tough job. They met after hours in bars and back rooms, fuming. They talked about transfers, about unions, about how Carter wasn't one of them. One even called the local news anonymously, claiming that the chief's reforms are putting lives at risk. The story ran on a second-rate nightly broadcast, quickly drowned by louder headlines. But Carter saw it. He wasn't surprised. Accountability always feels like persecution to those who've never experienced it. But Carter wasn't interested in optics. He was interested in action. So he kept moving. Each day brought a new investigation. Old complaints were reopened, body cam footage was reviewed, and retired officers were contacted to confirm patterns of abuse. 2 more suspensions were issued by the end of the week. One was a sergeant who'd covered up misconduct for years. The other, a detective who had falsified arrest records to meet quotas. Carter didn't make speeches for each suspension. He didn't hold press conferences or send out internal memos. He just took action. Quietly, methodically, precisely. Because in a department where noise once reigned, silence now held power. Then something unexpected happened. A group of community leaders, pastors, teachers, small business owners, showed up outside the precinct with no cameras, no demands. Just letters. Dozens of them. Each one handwritten. Each one from a citizen who'd filed a complaint that went ignored. Until now. One read, "I never thought anyone would take my story seriously. Thank you for proving me wrong." Another, "I don't trust the badge yet, but I might trust you." Carter read everyone. They didn't bring him comfort. They brought him clarity. This wasn't just about cleaning house. It was about restoring something far more fragile than procedure or protocol. It was about restoring faith in justice, in law, in the people sworn to protect it. That night he stood alone in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the window, the precinct quieter than usual. He thought about all the weight still ahead, all the resistance he hadn't yet faced, all the hearts he'd have to win, not just inside the department, but out in the neighborhoods that had long given up. He knew reform wasn't a single event. It was a process, a battle, one that required relentless pressure, unwavering discipline, and something far rarer in law enforcement, humility. But in that moment, as he closed the final letter and stared at the badge on his desk, not his badge, but the one Daniels had thrown on the floor after being stripped of duty, he knew one thing for sure. The shield only has value if the people behind it are willing to be held accountable. Otherwise, it's just metal. And Chief Carter hadn't come here to polish metal. He came to forge meaning, one officer at a time, one day at a time. No shortcuts, no mercy for corruption. The cracks in the shield had finally begun to show, and through them, a new light was starting to shine. They say real change doesn't happen with noise, but with persistence, the kind that digs deep and keeps digging, even when no one's clapping. That's the kind of change Chief Carter had signed up for. And now, with the weakest links exposed and the strongest stepping into the light, the real battle began. The department's foundation had been shaken, but not yet rebuilt. The next few weeks tested every corner of the precinct. Carter's reforms weren't just written on paper anymore. They were being lived, challenged, stretched. Patrols had new supervision protocols. Traffic stops were audited randomly. Every officer was required to complete a new set of community engagement hours, and Carter made it a point to show up, unannounced, to some of those sessions himself. He didn't say much, just watched. Sometimes he'd walk alongside an officer during a beat in the neighborhood. Other times he'd stand quietly in the back of a church basement during a town hall. The community noticed, not because he was loud, but because he was present. And presence, Carter knew, was powerful. especially when it came from someone who wasn't hiding behind tinted windows or gold pins. Some residents still crossed the street when they saw a cruiser. Others stood their ground now, not out of defiance, but because they were starting to believe, not fully, not yet, but just enough to stay in the conversation, just enough to ask a question instead of shout an accusation. That was progress. But not everyone wanted progress. From the shadows, resistance grew louder. An anonymous online group made up of former and current officers began leaking internal complaints and attacking Carter's methods. They claimed he was weakening the force, bending to public pressure, and sacrificing real policing in favor of politics. Some even accused him of being more loyal to appearances than the badge. Carter didn't respond publicly. Privately, he doubled security for whistleblowers, expanded the Civilian Review Board's oversight, and hired an independent ethics advisor with a federal background. The message was clear. This wasn't about politics, it was about principle. Still, the stress took its toll. Officers who had coasted for years now found themselves under pressure, and not all of them handled it well. One veteran with a 20-year spotless record cracked under scrutiny, lashing out at a superior and resigning on the spot. Another, Officer Greeley, who once boasted about running the block without backup, quietly took a leave of absence. In truth, many who left didn't need to be pushed. They just didn't see a place for themselves in a world where power was questioned, not assumed. But Carter knew that was necessary. Because culture isn't changed by writing new rules. It's changed by shifting what's acceptable. And in the 13th precinct, the bar had been raised. Then came the internal investigation reports. Months in the making, painstakingly detailed. For the first time, patterns of abuse, neglect, and systemic failures were mapped out on paper. Undeniable, unavoidable. Names were redacted, but everyone inside the department knew who was who. It was like holding a mirror up to a face that had never looked directly at itself. Some turned away, others leaned in. Among them was Officer Sosa, who had become one of the most vocal proponents of Carter's reforms. Her courage inspired others, junior officers, dispatchers, even a few detectives, who had long felt silenced by the old culture. She started leading informal training sessions during off hours. De-escalation, cultural sensitivity, by-the-book protocol drills. Attendance grew each week, not because anyone was forcing them to show up, but because for the first time, it felt like doing the right thing mattered. Carter took note of every name. Change agents. He didn't need 100 heroes. He needed 10 who wouldn't flinch when the heat came, and the heat was coming. One morning just before dawn, Carter received a phone call. It was the mayor. An incident had occurred. A civilian, black, unarmed, mid-20s, had been hospitalized after a use-of-force encounter with an officer from the 13th. Body cam footage showed the man complying until the takedown. A knee on his back, no weapon in sight. The officer was a holdover, not suspended, not reassigned, someone who had slipped through the cracks. Carter didn't wait. By sunrise, the officer was placed on administrative leave. By noon, Carter had met with the family. By sunset, the footage had been released to the public. Unedited, uncut, transparent. The backlash was swift. Protesters gathered at the steps of the precinct. Media vans lined the block. Critics demanded Carter's resignation, claiming his reforms were too little, too late. He stood before the cameras that night, not with anger, but with responsibility. "We failed," he said. "I failed, and I will not defend the indefensible. But I will say this, change does not erase injustice overnight. It lays the path to prevent it from happening again. That path remains, and I will walk it with anyone who refuses to turn back." The next morning, something unexpected happened. Among the crowd of protesters was the victim's brother. He stepped forward during a pause in the chants and asked for the mic. With tears in his eyes, he spoke. "I'm angry, but I see something different this time. When we knocked on doors, someone opened it. When we asked for footage, we got it. When we asked for truth, it didn't come filtered. That don't erase what happened, but it means something." Silence, and then a few nods. Not acceptance, but acknowledgement. That night, Carter didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because he was reminded that progress doesn't shield you from pain. It just gives that pain a purpose. The officer involved in the incident was later charged with misconduct and excessive force. A full federal review followed. But so did something else. Applications to the 13th Precinct Academy rose by 37%. And among the new recruits were individuals who cited Carter by name. Not as a hero, but as a reason. A reason to believe that the badge could mean something again. That summer, Carter received an envelope. No name. Just a return address that led to a quiet suburb outside the city. Inside was a note. "You spat on me. You didn't see me. Now I see you. Keep going." It was signed M. He didn't need more. Because sometimes the loudest redemption comes not in public applause, but in quiet recognition from the very people who had every reason to walk away. Months passed. Reforms hardened into routines. The precinct became a model, cited in national conversations, praised in watchdog reports, studied in policing programs. But more importantly, it became human. A place where people made mistakes, but were held accountable. A place where fear no longer ruled, and where silence no longer protected the worst among them. Carter never declared victory. He knew better. He knew corruption doesn't vanish. It waits. It sleeps. It finds cracks and creeps back in when no one's watching. But now people were watching, inside the precinct, outside the precinct, and within themselves. And that, he believed, was the point. Not perfection, but presence. Not fear, but courage. Not silence, but truth, spoken clearly, even when it shakes the walls. And in that truth, something remarkable happened. The badge became a promise again, not of power, but of protection, not of control, but of service, not of silence, but of justice. And this time, people were listening.